There have been 2 fires in the past 2 days in high-rise buildings in New York and Chicago. Both have underlined the possibilities for tragedy in a modern skyscraper fire. We have a report from ABC's Ann Medina.
This is fiction.
The towering inferno.
100,000 people work at the Trade Center. Many of them may be scared, but fire officials say that even with the problems that exist, fiction couldn't become fact.
Saying that we can't have serious fires, and we have had serious fires. We consider this a serious fire, but we would not have I do not think that it's highly likely that we would have a fire similar to the one that they portrayed in the Towering Inferno.
I tried to leave the building, but as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion and another rumble and more smoke and more dust. I ran inside the buildings, the chandeliers shook, and again, black smoke filled the air. Within another 5 minutes, we were covered again with more silt and more dust. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
Welcome to your 911 investigation into why the towers fell, where you'll learn what did and did not happen according to the laws of science and the available evidence. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. Each tower weighed over 500,000 tons, had 110 floors with 6 basement levels, and over 100,000 tons of tempered structural steel. Let's begin by reviewing the structure of the towers. The main weight-bearing superstructure was the core, comprised of 47 tempered steel columns. They were trussed together in a weight-bearing design that simulated a steel tree trunk. This design gave it immense vertical strength while also allowing it to sway in the wind without any structural decline to the load-bearing sections. Think of the core as a massive steel tree trunk in the middle of the World Trade Center. The core's foundation was cemented several stories underground and mounted several feet into the Manhattan bedrock, where it was bolted secure. The elevators and stairwells were located in the spaces between the core columns in the center of the building. The other significant weight-bearing structure was the outer columns. 60 box columns ran along each side with a super box column anchoring the ends. These columns were in prefabricated 9-ton sections that spanned 3 floors each, with the layout staggered for added strength. Their main purpose was to handle wind forces and distribute them evenly across the structure. It was designed to function like a window screen around the box. It could be punctured multiple times and still not fail. The outer box frame and inner core were connected by the floors. The floors were comprised of 1-inch steel with 4 inches of concrete laid out across the top and spiked in secure. Each floor only bore its own weight, with the core bearing the cumulative forces. Along with providing the usable space, the floors added stability to the entire structure by linking the core and the box frame. The cores were supported by over 23,000 single and double steel trusses per tower. Knitting it all together at the top was a large web of trusses called the hat truss. This was arranged like our giant railroad bridge of trusses spanning the top 5 floors and cementing the structure firmly together at the top. There was more steel per floor in the World Trade Center than any other skyscraper in the world. But for as strong as these buildings were, they would be no match for what they faced on September 11, 2001. Numerous survivors testified to explosions near the base of the towers, both before and after the impact. The official story states this was caused by a fireball created by the jet fuel igniting.
Trade Center when the first plane struck.
And all of a sudden it sounded like, I don't know where the subway is, but it sounded like a subway collision, a bomb, and it was just pounding, boom, 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 and I literally thought the subway had exploded and all the cars were supposed to land on top of us. It was so loud.
And what'd you...
I was standing next to One World Trade Center, and then all of a sudden I heard rumbling, and we all started running away from it. The glass like blew out and threw me onto the sidewalk, and I couldn't see for like 20 seconds.
We had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that. Tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something? You gotta get back to me. I got an eyewitness who said there was an explosion on floor 7-8. 7-8. We just had another explosion. Warren Street because of the secondary explosion. We've got numerous people covered with dust from the secondary explosion. And we got another explosion on the tower, 1013. Tower 2 has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse surrounding the entire area. Who's involved in the secondary explosion at Tower 1K? I've got 4-1 should have taken a couple of companies that they were leaving back to us.
When the plane crashes, we are told that part of the fireball went down the elevator shaft and exploded out on the 78th floor, the 50th floor, the 22nd floor, the lobby, and the basement levels. It kills or injures several people in the lobby and the basement, disables all the elevators, and floods the subway with smoke.
Yes, I was right there. I was down in the basement, came down, all of a sudden the elevator blew up, smoke. I dragged the guy out, his skin was hanging off, and I dragged him out, and I helped him out to the ambulance.
The kerosene fireball explanation is highly unlikely and borders on the impossible. Let's examine some of the reasons this is so. Compared to the space, the volume of jet fuel was relatively small and would not have had the energy to send a fireball that far. Here is what 8,000 gallons looks like. Now, compare that to the tower. Next, we are presented a seemingly made-up chart stating that only 20% of the kerosene burned in the fireball and 80% remained in the building to burn. That means only this much fuel was used for the fireballs. About as much as a standard hot tub, which isn't even enough fuel to create the 40-story fireball we see on the outside. A kerosene fireball is a volatile chemical explosion. Fireballs differ from standard bombs because they have a very short period and radius of explosive power and do not create powerful shock waves. Instead, they work to equalize the surrounding pressures through the path of least resistance. If a fireball can equalize its pressure, there is no shock wave beyond heat. A kerosene fireball has two distinct phases, a positive phase which explodes outward, and a negative phase which retracts backwards. The South Tower plane impact is a great example of this. Let's take a look. During the positive phase, the blast pressure wave moves outward from the point of detonation, seeking to equalize its pressure. It lasts a short period of time and delivers the most energy of the event. The negative phase lasts 3 times longer and is less intense. It is formed as the outrushing air is compressed and forms a vacuum at the point of detonation. The vacuum causes the displaced air to reverse its movements and return to the point of detonation. Here we can see the smoke showing the air returning to the point of detonation. A bomb's blast wave is almost entirely positive force. It cares little about equalizing the pressures and continually moves away from the point of detonation with extreme force. Where a fireball shock wave is produced by heat and expanding vapor, a bomb shock wave is produced by combustion of solids and gases. The fireball from the tower impacts have plenty of room to equalize their pressure. They seek the path of least resistance. The open air 80 stories above ground was the path of least resistance. There was no reason for the fireball to explode downwards in the building when the path of least resistance was outside of the building, and the positive phase is happening outside the building. But let's suppose some of the positive phase was trapped inside and got into the elevator shafts. Could it have traveled down the elevators and blown up in the basement? Here is a chart of the elevator setup for the towers. Each tower had 99 elevators. However, only 2 shafts containing 4 elevators ran the length of the building. The tower's floor plan was arranged like 3 separate buildings stacked on top of each other. Each layer had its own self-contained elevator system that was hermetically sealed at the sky lobbies. 95% of the elevators were local elevators that only serviced one section of the building.
The architect believed elevators could be used in a completely new way.
His idea was to start out by building a 44-story building, which only uses 30 to 40% in elevator space. We added on another 44-story building on top of it, and then add another building on top again, which used the same elevator space again as the two below it. Now, when you wanted to go to someplace from 44 to 74, you took the express elevator, this blue one, they went from the lobby to 44, the first sky lobby. Then you had to change, and you took one of these other elevators again to get to your floor. And if you worked above 78, you took another express elevator to the 78th floor, which was the second sky lobby, take you less than a minute, about 50 seconds, and then you would cross over, right, and you would travel one of these orange elevators to your floor. If the building wasn't built with the sky lobby concept, it wouldn't have been done at all.
Using sky lobbies, the designers cut the number of elevator shafts in half.
Only elevators 6, 7, 50, and 51 ran the full length of the building. Of these 4 elevators, only number 50 was functioning on 911. Elevators 6, 7, and 51 were being serviced and their shafts were sealed. The only shaft a fireball could have traveled all the way down to the lobby in was the 50 shaft. Around the time the plane impacted, elevator 50 was in use and plunged several stories to the ground. The 2 people that were inside survived.
You were manning what, a freight elevator?
I was running 58 car at the elevator that go from B6 to 108th floor.
Where were you when it happened?
Well, I was on my way from B2 to 49th floor. And as I took off, it was a matter of seconds, 5, 6, 7 seconds, I don't know. And there was a loud explosion and the elevator dropped. And when the elevator dropped, was a lot of debris and cables falling on top of the elevator. And I put my hand over my head and I said, oh God, I'm gonna die. But I didn't know what was happening. When the elevator finally stopped, they had an explosion that bring the doors inside the elevator. And I'm sure that was broke my leg. And then they had another explosion on the panel that threw me, against the wall. And I guess I was unconscious for a couple of minutes because somebody else was in the elevator with me. And they say that they was trying to get my attention and they didn't get no response from me.
It is highly unlikely that a fireball traveled down this shaft and destroyed the lobby and basement, but spared these 2 passengers. The lower levels had to be destroyed by solid combustion explosions on the lower levels. There is no other logical explanation. Regarding the fireball disabling all the elevators, the separate elevator systems were all on different power supplies and even had separate backup power supplies at Building 7. The power remained on in the towers. You could not take down one power grid and disable all the elevators in the towers. Multiple power sources, some of them off-site, needed to be disabled for this to happen. Lastly, kerosene fireballs are lighter than air and travel up, not down. A kerosene fireball traveling down is like a flow of water traveling up. It can be done, but the fireball would need to be super pressurized to do it. And once it explodes out on the 78th floor, it's going to not only lose that pressure, it's going to change directions and move laterally onto the 78th floor instead of continuing down. It's lighter than air and seeks the path of least resistance. Fireballs leave a large heat, soot, and smoke footprint. When we see the lobby afterwards, there are no signs of soot, fire damage, or smoke. That's a sure sign no fireball hit the lobby. The fireball causing damage to the lower floors theory has to be false. While it is possible some jet fuel may have drained down the building, it did not come down in a fireball. Whatever it was that caused so much destruction below the impact zone was not a fireball. All of the steel in the towers was heat certified by Underwriter Laboratories before it was used. Steel was certified to withstand 2,000-degree fires for 2 hours without any structural failure. The initial NIST report claimed that the steel across 5 floors melted in a 2,000-degree fire. This was publicly disputed by an executive at Underwriter Laboratories, claiming there's no way the steel would have failed from that fire, and that there was no way that fire burned at 2,000 degrees. As a result, NIST amended their claim, stating the steel didn't melt, but instead softened enough to fail in an 1,800-degree fire. So they basically changed the wording, but stated the same conclusion that fire caused the steel to fail. So Underwriter Laboratories retested the steel for NIST to see if it could lose strength from the heat it experienced. Trusses and floors were constructed and subjected to 2,000-degree fires for over 2 hours. The same result as before. The steel didn't melt, it didn't significantly soften, and it didn't collapse. The kerosene fire could not have caused the collapse. Armed with these test results, NIST pivoted to the "we don't know why it collapsed" position, and the inward bowing theory was born. The explanation of the inward bowing theory has evolved. First it was melted steel, then melted girders, then melted bolts, then collapsed floors, etc. We will focus on what seems to be the most adhered to version of late. The theory is as follows. Hot pockets of fire caused the floors connecting the 2 support structures to soften and lose half their strength and begin to bow downwards. As the floor bowed, it pulled the side of the outer columns inward, causing the outer box to lose its structural integrity. So basically, the box frame gets pulled in and fails. Oddly enough, the cartoon also shows the core bowing inward, which would be impossible, but that's the theory. Let's see it in action. Now the bowing happens, and the collapse begins, and the top falls straight through the path of most resistance. And not only that, it's falling at a speed that's almost as if there's no resistance. It's falling at a speed that is challenging the second law of gravity. A pancake collapse is described as a building collapsing down on itself, floor by floor. Each new impact meets resistance from the floor it's collapsing into, creating drag. It's physically impossible for the towers to have gained nearly the speed gravity would allow, or gained speed period, with this much resistance in the way. It is physically impossible for the towers to have gained speed during a natural collapse unless they are experiencing zero resistance. Resistance creates drag, and drag slows you down. We have already gone over the tower's architecture, and we know there was massive resistance. A billiard ball falling from the top of the World Trade Center would take 9.32 seconds to hit the ground. With the only resistance being air, it falls at the speed of gravity, which means it gains speed until it reaches its max. This chart shows resistance being encountered only every 10 floors. Even with this limited amount of resistance, the collapse should have taken over 30 seconds. Additionally, the towers were not only designed to easily bear their own weight, but to also withstand an additional 13,000 tons of outside pressure. There is nothing to indicate the lower portion of this building could no longer bear the weight of the top. So what we are seeing here is over 10,000 tons of solid tempered steel pulverizing every second with zero deceleration. The building is not pancaking, it's pulverizing. Everyone can agree the buildings were pulverized into largely dust and small debris. When pulverization is the outcome of the collapse, it changes the physics drastically. Pulverization indicates a huge force, a pulverizing force. When this is the case, we must account for Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Scientists use this law for gravity in rockets and planes, but it applies to all motion and the forces they exhibit. When we apply this to the World Trade Center, in layman's terms, it means a small mass cannot completely crush a large mass. There is simply not enough potential energy in the smaller mass to generate the force. The force applied is the same on both sections. In the collapse, both items are the same structure and composition. Let's have a look at this. Here are both sections of the building at the time of collapse. If 10 floors on the bottom were pulverized, then 10 floors on the top must also be pulverized. The same amount of force used to pulverize the bottom must also be applied to the top, pulverizing it. And so on until the smaller mass runs out of energy. In other words, there should have been this much of the building left, or a type of collapse that did not involve pulverization. Now one might think, well, the force of the top pulverizing triggered a pancake collapse from floor to floor. That is still impossible. Let's say this floor pulverized itself on this floor, causing it to collapse and pulverize itself on this floor, and so on down the building. Can you recognize how Newton's third law makes this impossible? For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. If the top floor pulverizes, the bottom floor must experience the same force and reaction. Earlier, we learned that the floors were independently supported and only bore their own weight. This massive force indicates that if the top floor is pulverized, then the bottom floor must also be pulverized. When both floors pulverize, there's no more energy for the collapse to continue and it ends. You can pancake something, or you can pulverize something, but it's physically impossible to do both at the same time. The Twin Towers became the first and second self-pulverizing buildings in history. So we've now learned that a natural collapse is in violation of two laws of physics. If your conclusions are not supported by the laws of physics, then they're wrong. The pancake collapse was originally a conclusion FEMA outlined, and certain publications have used it ever since, even after NIST admitted it was impossible. It is physically impossible for a pancake collapse or a direct weight implosion to have pulverized the World Trade Center. There is a very large distinction in the world of science between laws and theories. Laws are not debatable, they're not challengeable. Attempting to debunk the laws of physics speaks loudly towards one's credibility. If a natural collapse of this manner is physically impossible, we have to look for other evidence suggesting potential causes for a total collapse. Dr. Stephen Jones and other researchers have published findings of a designer explosive called nanothermite in the dust residue from multiple places around the site. Let's learn what thermite is.
This is thermite. It's a powdered mixture of iron oxide and aluminium, which when ignited burns at 2,500 degrees Celsius, which is very, very hot. This is liquid nitrogen. It's specially stored at minus 198 degrees Celsius. That's 163 degrees colder than the North Pole in winter. But is it cold enough to neutralize the intense heat of thermite? Triggers the irreversible thermite reaction. As scorching hot meets freezing cold, a fierce battle rages. The smoke clears, and incredibly, nothing remains. As the thermite burns at 2,500 degrees, it releases a raging torrent of molten iron, which rains down upon the liquid nitrogen, boiling the glacial mixture away in a plume of vapor and melting the cylinder, leaving just a puddle of white-hot iron.
Large quantities of unreacted thermite have been found throughout the debris site. It was pointed out that if thermite was used, there must be tons of tiny iron spheres also in the dust, as they are a byproduct of a thermite reaction. When researchers looked for these tiny steel balls, they were indeed everywhere. These spheres are created by a reaction of iron oxide and aluminum and are created in high quantities during a thermite reaction. The presence of massive quantities of these iron spheres verifies that thermite was used. This study indicates that more than one variety of nanothermite was used. Now that we have the physical evidence indicating thermite was used, we need to look for other data points from the collapse that would further confirm this finding. Did the collapse and its result contain things we would expect to see from a thermite demolition? For a building to implode into its own footprint, the bottom supports need to be cut at perfect angles and in perfect timing to cause the building to fall precisely. Here is an example of how demolition cutter charges are placed at the base of a building. This needs to be done with mathematical precision. The chances of a building falling into its own footprint naturally are astronomical. It has to be designed to implode a specific way. Here are the columns from the towers. When we see the columns that remain, they show this type of cutting with almost military precision. There is also melted metal around these cuts. This is what we would expect to see from a thermite demolition. In a controlled demolition, the term squib refers to explosions taking place below the crush zone. They are called squibs because they are blasts that burst out of the building and are clearly visible during the demolition. The towers had these explosive squibs all around the building and all along its length. It has been suggested that these are just puffs of air being ejected from the pressure of a pancake collapse. We already know that a pancake collapse didn't happen, so that cannot be true. And more to the point, air is invisible. If it were just air, we would not see squibs. The part that concerns us is the jet of smoke, not the air. What we are seeing is white-hot smoke being ejected out of the building. That is an explosive squib. This is what we would expect to see from a thermite demolition. For months after the collapse, the basements of the towers contained large pools of molten metal that remained over 1,000 degrees. Everyone from the first responders to the mayor of New York to the governor of New York acknowledged them. Seemingly everyone in New York knew there were molten fires at the bottom of the wreckage, except the company hired to investigate it. NIST denies the presence of molten metal in the wreckage.
Well, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
From a volcano.
No eyewitness who said so.
There actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
No eyewitness who said so.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
No eyewitness who said so.
And the cleanup was very difficult. The steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks at least.
No eyewitness who said so.
NIST's denial of this well-documented fact is a type of gross incompetence that alone discredits their entire investigation. The molten metal existed, and this is what we would expect to see from a thermite demolition. This is the dust cloud created by the implosions of the building, except it's not a standard dust cloud. This is what's known as a pyroclastic density current, or pyroclastic flow. Unlike a traditional dust cloud, these are created by the release of extreme heat and energy. The tephra is hot and heavy and hugs the ground as it spreads, even clinging to water. A normal dust cloud quickly dissipates in the air because it's lighter and not bound together by heat. The only thing known to create a pyroclastic density cloud naturally is a volcano. This is what we would expect to see from a thermite demolition. So we have found the physical presence of nanothermite, its active residue, and 4 data points that support a thermite-controlled demolition. The only conclusion we can draw from this evidence is that the World Trade Center collapses were controlled nanothermite demolitions. fully understand how the buildings collapsed, we must first recognize the role nanothermite played. The towers were rigged with two different kinds of thermite. The first was a very refined powder thermite with added barium nitrate that generates heat up to 4,000 degrees. The second was a larger coarse thermite with added phosphorus that packs a massive explosion. To keep it simple, we will call them melt and explode thermite. As they are both thermite, they both explode and both get hot, but melt thermite doesn't explode nearly as powerfully as explode thermite, and explode thermite doesn't get nearly as hot as melt thermite. They are engineered for specific roles. The buildings were rigged with thermite in the following way. Melting thermite was attached to all the core columns all the way down the building at 2 floor intervals. It was also planted in the corners of the box frame from the 91st to the 96th floor. Exploding thermite was attached to the inner walls of the core the full length of the building at 2 floor intervals. Exploding thermite was also attached to the bedrock mountings at the base of the building and a few other key locations which we will now observe. Shortly before, during, and after the plane impact, there are 3 massive explosions at the base of the building. These are caused by the core being blown off its mounting on the bedrock below basement 6. These explosions cause massive damage to the lower basement levels, kill or injure several people in the basement, and flood the subway with smoke. The core is now no longer mounted onto the bedrock. During the plane's initial impact, the mechanical engineering room on the 75th floor, 20 stories below the impact, is blown up. This disables and in some cases destroys the upper elevators. The blast also sends elevator 50 plummeting to the basement and destroys part of the core in that area of the building.
World Trade Center 1, and it's not was. I am here, and I'm stuck right now.
Are you in smoke? Are you in fire? I mean,
the first thing that I want to make clear is that I'm stuck on the 86th floor. A fire door has trapped us. Debris has fallen around us, and part of the core of the building is blown out.
How many people are with you, Jim?
I'm with one other person, and I'm told that people are aware of this. I'm on the 86th floor on the east side of the building facing the East River.
Describe what you felt.
I felt just the whole building. I heard a noise, felt the whole building shake, and saw glass blown out. The glass on my floor was blown out from the inside of the building out, rather than the exterior windows being blown out.
And what
glass fully shattered, and just the core of the building, the interior core of part of the building collapsed. Hello?
We just want to pass it. Jim, hang right there with 1 second. For folks that are in New York City, all bridges and tunnels.
At various times over the next 40 minutes, explosions also strike the following locations. The 22nd floor, which housed the Security Command Center. This disables the remote elevator overrides, the fire sprinklers, the security cameras, and the fire door locks, which creates havoc for the first responders and the people trapped on the upper floors. Local elevators and 2 stairwells are blown up near the 50th floor. This limits the escape route to only a single stairwell. The bases of several core columns are blown with shape charges at ground level up through the 4th floor, pre-weakening the building. These blasts kill and injure several first responders in the lobby, and it fills it with smoke and debris. This ends any large-scale rescue effort, and the first responders would soon be pulled back.
What happened? It was an explosion. We was in the lobby, and then fucking the 3rd explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
What was it like? What was it like?
Horrible.
It's like hell. You don't want to know.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Was that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the...
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion. Because we was inside waiting to go upstairs, and on the way upstairs, the whole fucking thing blew. And we just collapsed on everybody inside the lobby.
Similar to the first tower coming down, secondary?
I don't know about the first one, but I know the second one, it was terrible. Then there was a 3rd one, too, after that one.
Third explosion after that?
Yes, sir. Everybody was inside the building, waiting to go upstairs, and they just let loose. Everything just let loose inside the building.
The 93rd and the 97th floor burned for an hour with some minor fires in the corner of 92. Here is a picture of the North Tower just before the South Tower falls. The fires in front are burning out, and the bulk of the fire is in the southwest corner. 10 minutes after this, the smoke suddenly starts to ramp up. I want to take you through the last 10 minutes before the collapse at 5 times normal speed. Just over 9 minutes before the collapse, there is an explosive event and smoke is forced out of the 94th and 92nd floor. The melting thermite has been triggered in the upper portion of the building, every other floor. It's attacking all 4 corners and the core columns and begins heating them up thousands of degrees. The south tower damage allows us to see this in action as some melting steel escapes out of an exterior hole in the corner. Now the smoke begins pouring out and an incredibly hot fire spreads across the 92nd floor. It even leaves char marks on the outside columns as it spreads. So the building has been attacked by secondary explosions that both pre-weakened it and hindered the rescue and firefighting attempt. The reason the south tower falls first is because firemen reached the fire on the 72nd floor and began reporting what they saw on the radio. Whoever demolished this building was likely monitoring the firemen chatter, and once they learned the firemen had reached the impact zone, that put the building demolition on a fast track. Now keep your eye on the roof line and watch the smoke. At just over 3 minutes before collapse, the rest of the melt phase is triggered and the entire core, the length of the building, is being melted in sections. Now the smoke goes wild. Now we can notice smoke going out of the building lower and lower, and smoke being forced towards the ground lower and lower. During this phase, several rescue workers and phone calls from people both above and below the impact zone in both towers report that they are literally burning up. By now we can observe the smoke line across the box columns on the 92nd floor has spread all the way across. So the entire 92nd floor turns into a raging inferno in only a few minutes. This is from the load-bearing structures being melted all around it. It's likely they wanted to make the collapse appear to start on the 92nd floor. But it doesn't. Let's take a look. It starts at the 97th floor. I've marked a burn spot on the 109th and the 97th floor. The building fails at the 97th floor. When the collapse begins, it seems like the top is shrinking. I've marked the roof line and the 91st floor with fixed lines. It appears the top is destroying itself, but actually it's just vanishing. Let's zoom in again so we can observe exactly what's happening at the start of this collapse. The floors have been marked in yellow and the vertical wall of the corner is marked in red. Here we can see the collapse has just started to reach the 92nd floor. It has pulverized 3 floors, yet a full 5 stories off the top have disappeared. As it crushes the 92nd floor, it's only pulverized 4 floors, yet we can note a full 8 floors are missing off the top. And as we crush the 91st floor, a whopping 11 stories have disappeared. In 3 seconds, the top turns from 18 stories to 7. This is because there's no inner core left. The floors haven't really disappeared. The entire top of the building is slumping down on itself from being melted. The contents are being blown out the back. The floors in the upper section have begun compressing to half their size. The only thing still intact are pieces of the box frame. Now we have a severely pre-weakened building, and the collapse itself is triggered by an explosion at the top of the building. This explosion blows out the top and the side. It's most likely attacking the hat truss. Now, keep your eye focused on the roof of the building in this spot. It blows out with a traditional banana-shaped explosive plume. What verifies this is not a natural event caused by the collapse is the acrid black smoke plume left behind. In a natural event, the debris is the smoke plume. There is not a black smoke plume from a concrete pulverizing event. This is a clear sign of an explosive blast wave breaching the roof as the collapse begins. The final death blow was triggered here. Once the slumping building reaches the fire line, the explosive phase is triggered. As it impacts the lower section of the building, the top falls slightly off center, and from below we can observe explosions taking out the remaining portion. What you are seeing here isn't flashes from a thermite explosion, it's flashes from a detonator igniting magnesium. Nanothermite needs to get very hot to ignite, and traditional black powder fuses usually won't work. Igniting nanothermite requires something to burn very hot and steady, so they use strips of magnesium detonated around the product. What we are seeing is magnesium strips being ignited to trigger the explosive thermite. Once the thermite blows, all we will see is dust. In general, the same sequence of events leading up to the collapse hits the south tower, but the collapse phase strikes a little differently. It melts in half unevenly and the entire top of the building breaks off. As it breaks, the bottom section of the tower acts like a fulcrum, causing the top to tilt and begin to tip over, which is what should be happening in this situation. When the explosive phase is triggered, the fulcrum suddenly disappears, causing the top to stop rotating and go into freefall straight through the path of most resistance. And like the North Tower, the natural collapse violates two laws of physics. I don't suppose the explosive phase requires much description. We can clearly observe uniform and synchronized explosions running down the length of the building, pulverizing them. This part we've all seen several times. End result of this, two pulverized steel buildings and giant pools of molten steel in what used to be their basements. Finally, we should discuss the mysterious vanishing columns. These are massive 50-story sections of the core columns that seem to vanish into thin air. Some argue they just fell over, but that's not likely because there would be large sections of them on the debris pile, and there aren't. Others suggest they are disintegrated by an external focused energy weapon of some type. This is unlikely since the building was already rigged with a massive amount of nanothermite. I agree the building melts and pulverizes, but there is zero evidence of an exterior energy weapon. Another theory is we are just seeing huge columns of dust that somehow froze in midair for a few seconds. This would be highly unusual. We have these columns recorded from several different angles and they appear to be a solid mass. I agree they are coated with dust from the event that just happened, but the columns are there. By now I bet you understand what happened to these columns. They are melted in sections by pre-placed nanothermite just like the rest of the columns. Perhaps a few charges were duds, or perhaps they were in a spot that vented their heat faster, but in the end they are melted in sections just like the rest of the core. For all we know, these columns are this. Or this. It would stand to reason that pieces of these columns would be the most recoverable since they are the only things we can verify that survived the explosive blast wave. So there you have it, melting and exploding. The buildings were pre-weakened and then demolished in a controlled demolition fashion. In the year 2000, the Scientific American stated, "They just don't build them as strong as the World Trade Center anymore." We can only wonder if they ever will again. Thank you for watching part 2 of your 911 investigation, Why the Towers Fell. Part 3 of our 9-part investigation is in production. Stay tuned.